We're going to have a conversation now, but I want you to think about questions you have. If you want to write them on a card, our staff can go around and pick them up, and we can read them to the participants here and get some good conversation going for the last part of the day. Okay, we ready? I kind of feel like Oprah. This is my Oprah moment.
Me too. I feel like I'll guest on Oprah.
So this afternoon was really compelling. And what I saw was a lot of hope and possibility. And I love seeing possibilities. So I want to hear from you all if we can integrate everything that we talked about today, right? It's a big piece. But if we can integrate just looking and seeing individuals and families and the entirety of their experience and our work, what do you think is possible?
Well,
Go
I'll
ahead.
start. I'm actually excited. Like I talked about, I think that for us, I think each of us needs to lead with our strengths. And for us, the movement building part and trying to connect how we get there through leadership, taking a stance. That if we actually look at and have that open opportunity, then so many of our all of our communities can thrive for that, right? The piece about, I'm sure all of you can think about something that you or a family member has been shamed or stigmatized from. If we can start working from a destigmatizing frame, think about how we break down some of those pieces and put real intentionality into how we're opening the doors towards wider opportunity, then, like our sort of stuff says, all our families will thrive, not just one community. We could see a larger step towards really ending and preventing violence.
Thanks, Adriann. Any other thoughts?
I think everything can happen.
Yeah. That's the answer. Ding, ding. That was the right answer.
Ding, ding, ding.
Give this woman a prize. That was
when I think about sites of organizing, and this is an active conversation I think many of us in the progressive movements are having, right? So for the last century, the kind of site of community organizing has largely been centered around the workplace, right? You think about the most active organizing forces have largely been the unions. And today, I think there's a shift in momentum in helping people think about the family and the community as the site of organizing and activism. And I think it's born out of some real life experiences, one of the women's movement, right? And helping redefine what family space is and making it seen as valuable and important. I think it's born out of the LGBT rights movement, certainly marriage equality, but even beyond that, I cut my activist teeth doing HIV/AIDS work before protease inhibitors. So people were dying, right? And we grew up with a generation of gay folks who were kicked out of their families of origin and biological family, and so formed these revolutionary new chosen families, which I think is this new terrain for us to think about. And the work of Strong Families is absolutely amazing and right on, because it lets us catch up to what is already real in the world. Less than a quarter of the US population lives in a family that looks like the Cleavers. Less than a quarter. Most of us have families that are much more diverse or in different structures. And so if we think about really valuing each and every family, each and every system, then it just lets us meet our people where they already really are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Miriam.
I think I'm not sure what other choice we have, in a sense, if we're going to move forward. I think that there is a choice. There are many choices to be made, but we've ended up at this place of not just fragmented identities, but this hyper-individualism and this idea that either you're in, right, when we think about sort of addressing poverty or violence, either we're doing prevention, or we're providing intervention or services, or we're doing organizing or mobilizing. But the stuff that heals people and communities is the places where people can give and get at the same time. And allowing people, I think, to be seen in the entirety or the full frame of their lives helps us all we can all be approached. I know this sounds like total mush, but actually as people who have parts of ourselves that aren't so strong and that we need help with, and also at the same time where we have something to bring and give, and that's actually the part that's going to help us individually and collectively heal. But we've fallen into such a place, it's not just about being issue defined, where we require that people get sort of fixed up to a certain point, and then they can be part of fixing something else. And we're never going to get beyond that if we just stay focused on individual slices.
Great feedback. So we talked a lot today about the intersections of families around gender violence and racism and poverty and immigration and economic justice, reproductive justice, and trying to lift up all families. What policies come to mind for you all in terms of, I know we had some referencing to the immigration reform, but what other policies could communities be looking at, both at the community level, the state level, and the national level, that you think could really move us in the direction that we need to move?
I'm going to start again, if that's good. So I meant to mention this in my thing. I think both we have to think about our internal policies, so policies also within our organizations. A lot of the, like one of the Enlace Comunitario talked about was that, you know, just having, yes, we know you may have to collect Social Security numbers at some point, but having that as one of the first 5 questions on your intake form is not going to make an immigrant person feel like they're welcome there, and is actually going to scare them and intimidate them, right? Or, you know, there's some little things like that about how we can change shift some of the internal policies that we have. And then I'd like to also think about, I think there's a lot of all our people of color organizations were saying that, you know, so far, and I think folks have heard that pretty clearly in the DV and SA movement, that, you know, having our policy shifts only look at penalties actually is another way that isolates communities of color, right? Because who is the most, the people that are most likely to be facing penalties, where that doesn't mean that we're the most likely to be committing the violence, but that across the board, we're the ones that are gonna face the harsher penalties, that are men in the communities of color, and that so we're still separating families. We're still not thinking about what are all alternatives to incarceration. And then lastly, I want to throw in the piece, when we think about policies, not just to think in the sector of anti-violence work, but actually policies like driver's licenses for immigrants, that impacts the DV community so much, because if there's an immigrant woman that wants to leave her home, but she's not able to get a driver's license, that means she can't drive her kids to school, she can't feel safe driving in the streets to leave, and she can't, you know, open a bank account. So, you know, thinking about what are the policies that actually help empower our folks and help to decrease the violence that we're already facing.
That's great. Thank you, Adriann. Other thoughts?
I was going to say, I think we have to continue with sentencing reform. I think that we have to look young. There's a lot of new evidence coming out about discrimination in school suspensions, and that young kids of color are getting, so astounding to me, suspended from preschool and nursery school for being disrespectful.
Yes.
That's their job. They're 4 years old. Kids are disrespectful. I mean, right? I mean, they aren't fighting. They aren't hitting. They aren't doing anything. You know what they're doing? They're talking back to their teachers. They're 4 years old. They should know better, right? You can tell I don't have any strong feelings about this. And what the research is showing is how those are the kids that end up dropping out of school or being forced out of school. That is our prison pipeline. And if we want to address violence in our communities, we have to address the systemic violence that is being perpetrated against whole communities under the guise of order, under the guise of sending clear messages about structure, and under the guise of making it safe. There are a lot of these kids that are being pushed out because it's about making safe classrooms for the rest of the kids. Well, we need to support our teachers differently if having a 4-year-old having a temper tantrum on a given day is making a classroom completely unsafe for everybody else, and then that kid's mom has to quit her job or dad has to quit his job. I mean, there are all these ripples. I also think that we need to really, really look at child diswelfare in this country. There is not a state in the country that's doing it well. And that is the guise under which we are, the irony is the tension between child welfare departments and domestic violence and sexual violence workers is so present in just about every state in this country, which we should just stop and think about for a minute. How is that possible? Like, why is it so hard for the wisdom of the folks that have been in the trenches doing the anti-violence work to seep into how we do our child welfare policy? Yes, it's messy. Yes, it's complicated. But we have to figure that out on a systemic level. Otherwise, all the individual work we do with folks is just going to be feeding them back or their kids back into our systems.
That's great. We're not taking on anything easy here. We're going big. Okay, any other thoughts of policy, Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so what feels easy is to kind of do a list of things that would make a difference in people's lives. And I guess I want to challenge us to think about not responding or reacting, right? Not looking at the symptoms or the manifestations, but really to start to think about what is the world we want and how can we create it, and not be reacting. It's getting better about reacting isn't going to get us where we need to go. It's part of the answer, but it's not the game changer. So what does it look like to really think about what's the long term, what's the prevention, what's the life-giving, the love and the healing part? Like, how do we create communities and inspire folks to be their best selves? And so, I think it mostly should be about the root causes and getting after those, but I also think it should be done in a way that is, that we're paying attention to the how we're doing it, that we together are treating each other with love and respect, that we're beginning as we mean to go on, that it's not all the fighting and there's also a way of going about it that's about healing. I know I'm not being 100% clear, but I just feel like you can be a zealous advocate for social change and be about love. Like, love is the most revolutionary force there is. So, like, how are we ourselves engaging in relationship and taking care of this work in a way that we're changing ourselves as we're changing the world?
That's great. No, that's helpful. And it kind of ties into a next question here. How do you engage in the conversation among those who disagree that societal or governmental constructs oppress certain individuals? How do you begin that conversation when people come from a stance of disagreement? I think love is a good step. Other suggestions? It's a hard question.
Can you just repeat it?
So how do you enter the conversation among those who disagree that societal or governmental constructs oppress certain individuals?
I think I can start with just saying that I know it sounds a little cheesy even to me, but the story sharing piece. So you saw I was a young parent. I was 19 when I had my son, and recently in New Mexico we were able to pass some legislation for young parents and to actually have equal access to education in their public schools. What a revelation. So, when we came across and pushed that bill, so many legislators were like, well, what are you doing? You're encouraging young people. You're providing incentives for young people to go have babies. They're going to have a baby just so they could get these extra 10 days off of school. I mean, like, crazy stuff like that, right? And so what we just started doing, we brought up over 50 young parents to share their stories. But then once those 50 young parents, and we organized with a couple of the legislators who we knew, at first we only knew legislators who had been children of young parents. So we asked them to share on the floor of the legislature their stories of obviously being a successful person, even though their parent was a teen mom. And so they shared their stories, and then from there was other legislators that we didn't even know of that shared that they were actually young parents themselves, that they had children when they were teens. And then from there, other legislators started saying, well, I wasn't a young parent, but I'm a single mom of 4 kids, and I'm still doing this, and I'm a single dad of 4 kids, or I've been raising my grandchildren. So it just like, I almost go into a room and share that story. And in New Mexico, I'm assuming it might be similar here in in Idaho. In New Mexico, when I share that story of being a young parent is the first thing when I walk in a room, you wouldn't believe like half the room then all of a sudden is like, yeah, I was a young parent too. It just sort of sheds that burden and that stigma and lets you be in your own power. So some of that, just back to the story sharing, recognizing your own power piece.
Those are great thoughts. Story sharing, I think, can be powerful. I think just, Jackie, with your story today, just hearing the trajectory of that woman's life and all the different systems that were failing her was very powerful. Other thoughts from any other panelists on how to begin this conversation?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say start from a place of like humanity, right? So if someone doesn't believe that or they're resisting it, it's because we're all so swimming in this water that's so pervasive, we don't even know we're fish in the water, right? Like, so that's the first place, is assuming that it's coming from a place of the not knowing and like not realizing it, and really, you know, being from not having that personal experience of having interacted with. If you've interacted with, you know, social service systems, you know how this, you know, that you're not going to be fighting that. So it means that you don't have that personal experience, and you need to be. I think the way forward is to get introduced to it. So storytelling is one way. I think another way to do it is experientially. Like, it's one thing when it's intellectual. You're fighting a lot when you're fighting an intellectual piece, but like, what are the ways that you could engage in experientially to have that feeling and then tie that feeling to other people's lived reality? So, you know, there's the game of everyone stands in the circle and you pass a bag that has some toys in it or like goodies that people actually would care about. And so as you pass the bag, people in the circle, everyone gets to take one. Well, if you're at the front of the line, you get to take the iPad or whatever and the good stuff out. And by the time you're at the end, you've got like a stick of gum or like a penny. And like, then you're like, oh, look what happens. Like when there's resource scarcity and it depends on who's at the front of the line. And like, you can do things like that, that when that bag's coming around the circle, you're like, I wanted the iPad. Like, I don't want the gum that's, you know, 5 years old. And so like, you have that experience. And what are the ways that we could do that kind of stuff? Or I thought what you did where you asked us to cross ourselves off. You know, that first one, I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not crossing myself off. But like, how can we experience what that feels like and then have that be the place where we tie it intellectually?
That's great. That's great.
I love all those ideas. I think the coming out strategy has been so successful for so many movements in breaking stigma. And in the LGBT movement, right, it was about being around your family kitchen table and really relating with people in that way and giving them real life experience and stories. I do think, you know, I spend a lot of time trying to cultivate allies, particularly around racial justice issues, and particularly working with my white allies in the reproductive justice movement or the repro rights movement or the women's movement, because the women's movement is white dominated, right? And I think it helps to start building with folks who are willing to listen at first. And so if that questioner is asking about Bill O'Reilly, like, I don't care about Bill O'Reilly, right? We're not gonna get Bill O'Reilly to see white privilege exists. He doesn't wanna see it exist, you know, because it services him so well, right? Like, he has so much to benefit. But I think there are actually so many people in the world who have some consciousness and don't have any opportunity or know how to engage or how to have conversations that feel safe and can let them test ideas and test questions. People don't have guides, right, to how to be anti-racist or how to be a good feminist or how to be whatever, right? So I think building alliance and building relationships with that community first is going to be really valuable, because if we can do that, we'll see that we have critical mass. And really, it's like the 1%, right, who are going to be stuck in that place. But then we'll be 99 and we'll smash them.
I think to add one thing, I just want to build off that. I think we tend to get distracted by the people that really disagree with us the most. Just like a parallel process to in our work, we tend to get focused on the thing that needs to be fixed the most, and everything else gets thrust into the shadows. Yeah. And there are so many people. It doesn't mean that sometimes those people can't push everything to a grinding halt, But at the same time, we're leaving essentially all these people that could be assets in the short term and the medium term in terms of actually creating a tide. We're not going to create a movement if we start out by trying, or build a movement by trying to convert the hardest to convert first. We really would do ourselves a whole lot better by sort of leaving them till honestly, leave them till the end. There are so many people that are not maybe going to be the barn burners or whatever the right metaphor that we're supposed to use. I have 2 barns, I live on a farm. It's okay. But there's so many people that are just kind of want to be the second in the pool, or the third in the pool, or don't know how to have the conversation. Or if you say something to them, I love the metaphor of not even the metaphor, but that sort of that we're spending $1 million a foot, is it, on this fence, and how many mothers and fathers, I would think, aren't going to try and climb over that no matter what? Like, there are people that are going to find in that a complete, what we call head snaps. They're going to be like, oh, and everything changes. So let's get those head snap people first. And maybe one of them is actually married to, or a cousin to, or something to one of the people that we're never going to convince without a relationship.
That's great strategies. This participant has written, can you talk about the importance of language in the social justice movement and the benefit of naming the true oppressors? Will we ever be able to say men's violence against women, not just violence against women? And so what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the piece about language, I'll try and be quick about it. I actually was thinking about it as you guys were talking. So I briefly referenced the abortion ban that had reached a ballot in Albuquerque. When, like I said, we had worked several years to actually get women of color at that Coalition for Choice table. And so it was like 3 or 4 years of us like making those agreements and working across difference, finally getting to the table, to being able where we actually experienced a couple legislative sessions working together, so we were strong enough. So when that abortion ban came and we said we're going to be at the table, we're at the table together and we all have equal decision-making power, we created MOUs, we said, everybody was like, okay, we have to do what everyone else done. Let's talk about trust women. Let's, what are all the tools we have in our pocket? All these things about abortion is the most safe medical procedure, abortion is abortion that. And actually, the few of us were like, wait, you're going to be talking to you're wanting me to talk on TV to my cousins, families, and no, like, that's not the message I can carry to my families, because I'm not going to be fighting with my families over this, right? So we thought a little deeper, and what we led with was that message of respect. Because we knew in the end that just like my family, there's a whole spectrum about how people morally feel about abortion, but that at the very basis, we could all respect that we needed our own self-determination to make decisions about our own bodies and lives, and that no government or state entity should be telling us how to do that. So while my great-grand, my cousin, my grandma, my whatever, might have a totally moral objection to what I'm proposing, I could still move that person a little bit by saying, this isn't about that. This is about you having, and actually going door to door, we heard, and even in my own family, where people like, oh yeah, that time that my friend was pregnant and she was allergic to her pregnancy and they were thinking they might have to make that kind of, they could then remember or even relate to a time that, yeah, even whatever that person's moral decision might have been, they wouldn't want government trying to make that decision for them, or they wouldn't have to go through a whole process of laws and judges to decide that they could make the best decision for their family. So yes, we led with respect. We led with decisions. We rarely even talked about, that whole polarizing. So I think so much of our conversations are like this against that. How do we start to talk to the middle?
Other thoughts about language, violence against women versus men's violence against women in terms of accountability or just the conversation?
Miriam's pointing at me because during the talk this morning, I wrote to her a note that said, it's so interesting how many times examples of women being violent to men are being used. And I was like, what's going on with that? Yeah. What causes people to do that? And it's not intended as a criticism of the other speakers, but to notice that that's happening. And I was trying to think about why is that happening? And what I think is it comes from a place of not wanting to discount any survivor and wanting to make sure we're seeing everyone. And so I imagine that that's what motivates it. And a fear I have when I hear that is that we start then to lose what is the root cause of all gender-based violence, and to understand who is doing most of the perpetrating, and who is, where is the harm, and was it caused by, no matter who the survivor is. So I start to worry both about language that's neutral or language that is intentionally gives the impression of even, when that's not what the numbers look like. And so, that's why she's pointing at me. So I really was thinking about that today, and I think, as with any kind of oppression, it's super important that you are explicit about it, and we have to not shy away from it, and we need to practice being explicit. And then I think there's a separate question that you're raising, which is, what is the strategic language we want to use depending on what we're going after? Mm-hmm. So in the course of a campaign, what language do you use that will bring the most people along with you, that will help you win what you're trying to win, that won't turn people away, including men, and most men aren't perpetrators, so how do we get men not to be turned off? And so we need to have strategic conversations about what's the purpose right now of this message and what's going to work. But in this space, I think we should also be really intentional and explicit about what the truth and the facts are, and what's the oppression that we're seeing.
Could I add to that? So I mentioned it in my talk, the California project we're doing about defining success. We also have just completed a pilot of the same project with men who use violence. So you don't have to answer this, but I can make a prediction that a lot of people, when you say moments of success workshop with batterers, people are like, what? How you're successful battering somebody? And to me, what that says is that I struggle a lot with even before I got into this work, I found the English language terribly just challenging, and then there's all this nuance underneath how we use terms. But I have really been thinking about how much this matters in terms of labels and what they project. And that as much as, so just to carry this forward, as much as just allowing someone to be a survivor backs her into a corner and how we see her, when we only talk about batterers, not as people who use violence, which yes is more cumbersome, but all that we're doing is perpetuating this idea that that is the only identity somebody has, and that is all somebody is, which actually makes it very hard for even those of us who are in the work to think about to get beyond the assumption that that is all that they think about doing and that is all that they do. None of which is excusing, this is a side topic, but none of which is making any excuses for violence or anything like that. But it just has had me thinking about how language makes us take these shortcuts. Mm-hmm. And to Jackie's point, we have to be very, very aware of the shortcuts that we are asking people to take.
Well, and I would just build on to what you were saying about, then are we backing people into a corner so that's all they can ever be?
Right.
How are we inviting them to be their best selves and to come with us?
What, to be a better batterer? Right? Exactly. That if there's nothing else there to build on. Yep.
All right, that's great. So here's a question about the NFL. So instead of allowing the national focus that is currently on intimate partner violence due to Ray Rice, what would each of you do to maintain the ongoing focus in the conversations on national level beyond Ray Rice? And I think this is probably in response to the disturbing images that Jackie had of the young children in the Ray Rice costumes.
There was such powerful chorus of voices of women who had never told their stories before coming out right after that happened. And I think that's the kind of momentum we need to continue to build. Through the We Belong Together campaign, we call these platforms of leadership, right? Like opportunities for women to become change agents and to exercise their power and to express themselves. And in a very fundamental way, having survivors be able to tell their stories is a game changer. So I would hope that there are more megaphones that get passed out, more platforms for people to write blogs, more attention, more, and when people do tell the stories, we retweet it, we social media it, we really lift them up and celebrate the courage that it takes to do that.
That's great.
I want to know if there are kids out there who are getting dressed up as, is it Chris Carter? And some of the other folks that
I said Chris Brown, but no, I didn't.
No. Folks know?
Yeah, Chris
who
Carter,
this is?
NFL.
An NFL player who is a commentator, very highly regarded, very, very prominent ESPN, I think, commentator, who, it wasn't the Ray Rice, it was the Peterson, I think, case, but these all came down together, who talked about growing up in a home where he was beaten. And talked about how he was so powerful. He talked about how his mom did the best that she could with what she had, and now he knows that there are other ways to do it. There are other ways to discipline. And he was, so I think that there are lots of different kinds of survivors we can hear from, but I also think that part of the way of keeping the momentum is making sure that we are really honoring and lifting up and not just saying, oh, that's nice, and passing around the folks that are, but that are also countering this image that everybody in the NFL is abusive and violent.
I think we just also have to be real that we live in such a media-saturated world that taking, using those times that are tragic, but flipping it, making sure the stories that we want told are part of the wave of what people are seeing come across, that, we're ready for that.
All right, we got about time for 2 more questions. So could you share your vision for what you believe a community would look like that's violence-free? And when we think beyond programs and we think about how can we integrate nonviolence into all our institutions, I mean, what would you envision? What would it look like? It would look great, right?
Well, being able to work with Taiwan Women United, they always talk about the beloved community, which is very similar to like compassionate communities that people, and so much strength I've heard today from this morning's speakers, these folks, like that people are able to be their whole selves, live in their own power, aren't looking for approval from anybody or system. To me, that's the space where we hope to be, right? And when you're stepping into your own power, then you're not as susceptible to violence or those kind of things.
I'd actually point people to, so in MEV we work in cohorts, so Kelly's part of the second cohort of leaders, but our first cohort of leaders did this vision, and they drew a vision wheel, which comes out of Native American tradition, and actually Corinne Sanchez from New Mexico, one part of that's in that vision wheel is, she talked a lot about the violence against the earth, so there's environmental pieces of it, and connections that I would not have thought of myself, but looking at when those folks all put together and sort of drew their vision, it really is a very comprehensive picture of a world in which we're collaborating and everyone is thriving, and like it's a sense of just potential and like self-realization. And so I would love for you to take a look at that, both the visual wheel that they did, and then also they did a written document that goes with it that they tried to kind of write the pieces of it. But one of the best things about this, about visioning, I think, is that like you should look at it and see what's missing for you, and like that's the best part. And then when we're in that conversation, then the imagination spurs the ideas about what solutions look like.
I think for me, it's that people and families and communities have enough assets in each of those domains to actually weather challenges, which are inevitable, weather the challenges enough so that they can actually maintain hope, because I think hope is incredibly important, and some level of health.
I have to say, when that question was first asked, like John Lennon starts to play in my head about, yes, imagine all the people.
We're now going to sing for you
we
all.
We can all sing.
Because it's the end of the day.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
And my favorite line from Rent, right? Like the opposite of war is not peace, it's creation. Like it would just be so creative.
Mm-hmm. That's a great answer. So last question, what would be a simple step that anyone in this room could do in terms of trying to lift up all families in their work? Any suggestions?
I feel like I've already said the story sharing, this destigmatizing, think about from the front desk to the work you do with people one-on-one, to how leadership, or how you're building leadership, how maybe you're connecting. I think I used to work with youth in the criminal justice system, and so much was like, I'd see so many young people dropping off right when they're about to like graduate or finish the program. And often in our work, in service provision, you have just this short amount of time to work with them. You're like supposed to get them out of the program and resourced up and thriving again within 6 months or something like that. And so I'd build this great relationship. I'd be working with these young people, and they would be just about to get out of the program, and I'd be so excited for them. And they'd do something really silly and stupid to not be able to get out of the program. And I had this older woman that had been working in the work for a long time, and I told her, why do they do that? They're just about to finish. And she's like, because they don't want to lose you. And I realized then that I don't want to be the person that they rely on. I don't want them to have to rely on any one person. So how do we start building community? So I started thinking about, how do I connect them to organizations that are just building community, doing community building work? How do I connect them with something that's long-term and not reliant on a case manager yes, we need those people. It's critical, but how do we connect them to building the community resilience that they need that's long-term?
So I hope I gave you some tools for how to do that in my talk, but what I would say here is the first step is to try. And to try requires probably 2 things or 3 things. Like, get some buddies who want to try too, who are willing to be messy and talk it out, and then to fail. And to be proud of yourself for the try, and to pick yourself up again and try again. Changing the world is an easy business, right? We're gonna fail, and it's gonna be hard, and the best thing we can do is have grace with ourselves and each other, and to link arms and try.
That's great.
Me? I suggested some small questions that I think we can ask, not just of the people that are in our programs, but actually of each other. I think to appreciate that it is incredibly important to name and recognize violence and oppression, and yet there are things that are working in communities, no matter what. I don't know whether anybody heard, there was anybody who listens to NPR Weekend Edition, there was an amazing piece on a couple weeks ago. Yes, you can get probably a podcast of it. Just a short piece about Chirac, which is a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, and it's being called Chirac because of the high levels of violence. Huh. And there was a teacher who worked with kids, and the media was going in, and guess what? The media shows up every time there's a shooting, which means the media is always there, right? Long story short, this teacher does this project with her kids to talk about what their community is. And all that they can talk about, yes, they're able to talk about it's a place where there's violence and everything else, but it takes them a while to be able to talk about it, and then they produce this amazing piece on the guy at the corner store who will give them lemon heads, and the other person who makes sure that they get home safe from the school bus, and the fact that the reporters think that everybody who's in a suit is going to a funeral, and sometimes they're just going to work or just going to church, and mom is still making dinner, and dad's still showing up. And there are these things that are working and happening in our communities, even when they are deeply, deeply, deeply plagued with poverty and violence and oppression. And those are things that are really hard to see, because those aren't the things that we see when people are in systems. And so I think that the challenge and the opportunity for us is to figure out how to actually engage with communities in a way where we're also engaging with the entirety of communities, not just the entirety of individuals, but the entirety of communities, which again means embracing the fact that they are messy and contradictory, but it also is, I think it's ultimately more sustainable for us to do that, because it feeds us in a different way.
I'll share another kid story. My kids' school, they do a little family assembly as part of family diversity, and each kid gets to come up and say who is in their family, and they often draw a picture. And in my little ones, she did a family tree, and it made, my partner and I looked at it and we cracked up because it was Mama, and I'm called Baba. So Mama, Baba, her bigger sister, Penelope, and then Lonnie, who's a Cabbage Patch doll, made it onto the family tree. But so she introduced that as her family, and you know, everyone goes, "Is that a family?" And the whole school resoundingly answers, "Yes, that's a family." So I think if you ask the kids, who is your family, they all automatically have a really expansive definition of family, and I think it's up to us adults to implement that throughout our systems and policies. And there are actually, almost every single policy that gets passed has some opportunity at defining family, either an expansive way or a restrictive way. And I think we have to say, yes, that's a family, to the most expansive ways we can.
That's great. Thank you, Miriam. I want to thank all of our speakers today, Miriam, Katya, Jackie, and Adriann, and all of you for staying through the whole day, because I know it's a long day. Yay! This is our critical mass.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Idaho Coalition, I definitely want to thank Hannah Drabinski again. I don't know if Hannah's in the space. Did all the logistics. As well as the Idaho Coalition team and our Compassionate Communities Advisory Committee. I see Jason, Sherry, and a number of them here for really helping to envision this event. And hopefully that you can walk out of here and really believe that we can do the right thing so we can lift up all families so all families thrive. Thank you again for coming and for joining us here today.